Hey there, so today I want to pick up a story coming out of the aptly named Disney Star Wars is Dumb. Now, if you're on Twitter, you may know the handle Ichibaka. That person adds quite a bit to this conversation talking about Star Wars and on. Now, I personally like what is added here, and I would suggest that people go and check this source out because you're not just talking about the same drumbeat being pounded over and over again. Now, what you're talking about are different themes that deal and delve into Star Wars. And some of these themes, well, they look at things outside of the films. I think that's been a failing for a lot of people where they only look at films because when you think about what empowers Star Wars, true, you have to have the catalyst of movies. But after that, I mean, really think about what causes connectivity, what causes excitement. You were talking about toys. We're talking about merchandise. Things that went out and they resonated, and people, they scooped them up hand over fist. I mean, I think back to childhood, and I think back to the original trilogy coming out, and people, they went mad over that. Then when you had the prequels come out, people did the same thing. And when The Force Awakens, you had the same thing as well. But people, they tired of Disney, and they tired of Disney very quickly. And you can see that in the numbers. Also here, they're going to talk about comic books, and that is what I'm going to focus on with this. And I think the numbers here are telling, not only because you're looking at Star Wars and you're seeing this commodity fall off, but also, when you look at, say, a Marvel who is releasing that, it pretty much tells the story of what Marvel has been experiencing time and again. Marvel, they are a powerhouse when it comes to the comic industry. They pretty much own 40% of the market. So, I mean, they have a sizable chunk of it, sometimes over the 40% mark. But when you look at what comics have become, you're talking about more and more of a niche market, higher and higher pricing and less units being sold. This in a time where billion-dollar movies reign supreme. It's a crazy thing to look at, and it's very telling that something is inherently wrong, and yet nobody wants to talk about the why. So let's look at this. The state of the Star Wars franchise outside of feature films. Now, a user by the name of General Friendliness, they deserve credit with this. You know, I'm quoting it from here, but this basically is a repost of that from the discussion forums at kiwifarms.net, has made an interesting post with regard to the current state of various aspects of the Star Wars franchise, including books, comics, and other merchandise other than the films. Now, for myself, I'm going to focus on the comic book portion here. If people want to cover the other portion, let me know, and we could talk about that too. So here is with the comics. According to Comichron, Marvel Star Wars comic sales were very high when first released with TFA, but ever since have been in horrible decline, much like everything else. The main Star Wars comics and the 2015 print of Darth Vader had insane sales and were the best they had initially, with the first issue of Star Wars #1 getting over 1 million and being #1 on Marvel sales for quite a time, if I recall. However, the current Vader comics that started in 2017 after the 2015 run finished are nowhere near as high as the 2015 version, which made more than double what Dragon Ball Vader is making now. However, its sales are consistent. Not great, but consistent. The main Star Wars comics, though, are in complete shit right now and are dropping fast, with Darth Vader 2017 surpassing it easily. It doesn't help that aside from the shit stories, the main Star Wars comics no longer have decent art, as I've shown in this thread before. You can go check out other additions to that thread too. But continuing on, more recent sales show things to be even worse, with horribly declining declining art and story quality while people are creaming their pants over Vader, including some people who say they don't like Disney. Now, here are some sales comparisons. Now, when you're looking at these numbers, too, they're going to talk about Dr. Aphra, and they're going to talk about the Poe comics as well. So when you're looking at these numbers, remember that that's what's in here. Star Wars, Darth Vader, 2015, Poe Dameron, you have Dr. Aphra, and then Darth Vader 2017. Now, looking at these numbers, I mean, you notice a huge decline over time when you see these, and when you're talking about some of the characters here, and you think about the storylines and the overarching themes, yeah, you can see exactly why some of these fail. I mean, the Star Wars comics, when they first kicked off back in, you're talking about 2015 titles with Darth Vader and on, those titles were good. They resonated with audiences because they had quality storylines and they had quality art. Now, if you go in and you tune into the newer things that are out there, yeah, not quite so much. And then when you look at certain characters like Aphra, yeah, people, they are not impressed with that at all. I mean, I thought Dr. Aphra was actually going to be an interesting write-in when that character first started too. But of course, much to the chagrin of everybody reading it, the character that could have been, should have been, would have been, instead becomes one of those characters that is hard to look at. Very, very hard to intake. One of those that really gets on your nerves after a while. But looking at these numbers, I mean, do you notice the trend here? Do you notice how fast these numbers fall off too? I mean, you're talking about a steady decline here that when you looked at the initial Star Wars run, I mean, if you're talking about over, say, that 50K mark, I mean, it took a while to even get close to that. And yet, when you look at some of these other numbers, I mean, when you see the Poe Dameron numbers, that happens right around 7. When you look at the Aphra numbers, yeah, you're talking about at number 3. And then when you're looking at the Darth Vader 2017 numbers, I mean, when you compare 2015 to 2017, they are just, they're really telling. I mean, when you think about that. But let's continue on here. In spite of all the shitty praise and circle jerking it gets, Dr. Aphra has never sold more than 50K outside its first 2 issues. The Poe comics started off a little bit better, but went the same way as Dr. Aphra eventually. These are from 2017, and I'm told the sales have continued to drop since then, except for the 2017 Vader comics, which have surpassed the main Star Wars comic, but it's still just average when compared to the 2015 version. It also doesn't help that Marvel has been outsourcing Star Wars comics to IDW, which are horribly meh, yet still somehow more creative and original than Marvel's Star Wars comics. You know, when you say that too, you know, that is a scary thing. I mean, when you think about the way that IDW treats most of its outsourced commodities, most of those things, they are very milquetoast. You know, you're talking about lukewarm reception where you want, you know, something that'll actually be interesting, but instead, you know, you get something that is definitely nothing to write home about. It's something that I'm always eternally turned off by. I used to be optimistic about their comic books, but you know, when you think about anything that they bring to the stage these days, yeah, it's pretty much the same old drumbeat. You know, it's this perpetual thing that, again, it's some lackluster thing. And yet, when you look at that, I do have to agree that the Marvel Star Wars comics right now, IDW, they at least give them a run for their money. And that's pretty sad there. But continuing on here, as for story quality, Dr. Aphra and the main Star Wars comics are just abysmal beyond reason. Poe's comics are mediocre but tolerable, although I really don't care for the guy. See, that's where I have a problem with that as well. I have a problem reading that comic book because because I do not like the character within that. But continuing on, the 2015 Vader comics are the only ones with occasionally above average writing with some interesting moments and some dumber moments. It all varies. As for art, both Vader comics have the best art. Aphra in second, the waste of talent that should be used on the main effing comics, FFS. Poe in third, cheap, and the main Star Wars comics in dead last for worst art, which is evidently traced the majority of the time to save as much money as possible, since it is one of their quote-unquote big sellers. Also, even the comics that started off well ended up going to shit near the end, or ending on a really mediocre note. Also, finishing this off here, forgot to add that in 2017 run of Vader officially ended this week on the most drug-addled note possible. Some will call it artistic. For me, it's just an obvious crash full of quote-unquote remember this moments as Vader's soul travels through time, and she gets effed for no reason. I'll talk more about that if you want to go and check out what they have to say with it. I actually thought a lot of this was telling to go back in and look over prior posts and on, but I thought that this, like I say, is very good to talk about. Also, there are other things, when you're talking about game tie-ins, for example, when you talk about toys, it's a very sad note. Toys, period. That market, when you get down to it, yeah, that's a beast. It's a beast with its own burdens. It's something we can talk about at another time if you're interested in that. But looking at this and then looking at the numbers, like I say, you can just freeze on that. And I mean, when you look at the decline and you look at how quickly some of this stuff declines, it's very, very telling. It showcases not only where Star Wars is these days, but also where a Marvel is as well. You have to question what exactly is going wrong, and can they right that proverbial ship? But anyhow, you tell me what you think about this kind of stuff. If you read that too, tell me what you thought about the older titles versus these titles. Tell me what you think about all of this stuff in that. I'm curious exactly how people take that. Also, if you like this kind of content, please consider supporting. Please consider subbing, liking, and making sure to pop in for daily content. If you want to go beyond that, there are links within the description. I would definitely appreciate that, as it seems that YouTube does not like people for some reason. Also, just make sure, like I say, to click that bell so you can get you new updates daily. There's always something to talk about within this cultural phenomenon we call current year. And above all, within it, I want to thank you for being here. I appreciate it.